All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking, first of all, Good Chodesh, begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, so beautiful, all the way from Boston, for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month in appreciation of all of the learning, the Shiurim, and in honor of the entire Kehila. Our week of learning sponsors, the Weissport family in the merit of a Refuah Shalema for Dr. Weissport, for Aviva Bas Shena Chana. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Cholei Yisrael will have a complete and enduring Refuah. Both say with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71. And we left off yesterday on Ayin Amud Beis 70b. We left off with a svei. So we left off 2, 4, 6, 8 lines off from the bottom. Supposed to just reorient ourselves a little bit. We ended off yesterday with a really incredible machlokas regarding the halacha concerning a yoresh. So remember again our case. Abraham died. Abraham owned a home in the chutzner, which means he owns the real estate, he owns the chutzner, he owns the rights to the chutzner. And what happens? He dies. He dies on Shabbos. As a result, his son Yitzchak inherits his rights. Now the shaila is, Yitzchak obviously can't join in Eruv because halacha l'maaseh, again, the ability to join in the Eruv only comes about on Erev Shabbos. The shaila is, can he be mevatel his rishus? Can he go ahead and yield his ownership rights in the chutzner once Shabbos has already arrived? So this becomes a machlokes between Rav Nachman and Rava. So Rav Nachman said, Ani Omer mevatel. Right? Rav Nachman said, I hope that halacha l'maaseh, the yoresh, the inheritor, can be mevatel on Shabbos, but he quoted the members of the yeshiva of Shmuel, who said that you cannot be mevatel. So this has been the ongoing discussion starting now. So Esvei, so the Gemara is the kasha, Echad mibnei chatzer shemes, if one of the members of the chutzner died, v'niach rishus li echad min hashuk. Now, interestingly enough, what happens over here is as follows. What happens in this case is one of the members of the chutzner dies. V'niach rishus li echad min hashuk. Now, so again, if you can imagine, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov all live in one chutzner. Avraham dies, but Avraham leaves the right to his property to Echad min hashuk. Echad min hashuk means someone who doesn't live in the chutzner. He bequeaths his property, someone who doesn't live in the chutzner. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? What's the impact of this inheritor on the rest of the chutzner? So miba oyom oser. So if halacha l'maaseh Avraham died while it was still day, so the inheritor inherited his rights before Shabbos, and therefore, what's the halacha? So the inheritor asers the rest of the members of the chutzner from carrying in the chutzner, because he has ownership rights. He didn't join in an Eruv, so he forbids them. However, if Avram only died on Shabbos, then what? When the inheritor inherits on Shabbos, Eino Oser, he does not go ahead and forbid anything to the rest of the members of the chutzner. V'echad min hashuk shemes. We'll say similarly again, what happens if someone from the shuk? So remember again, someone from the shuk, we'll say just refers to someone who doesn't live in the chutzner. Echad min hashuk shemes. V'niach rishus al yachar. So we'll say in this case over here, a member of the shuk died, but a member of the shuk happened to own real estate inside of the chutzner. And he leaves his property. So the guy, we'll say in this case, we call him Echad min hashuk, but Lamaise, he owns property in the chutzner. He dies, he bequeaths, he leaves his property to another member of the chutzner. If he died while it was still day before Shabbos started, Eina Oser, then I both say ultimately again the inheritor doesn't ask, which makes sense because the inheritor inherits while it's still day before Shabbos, and therefore again he has the ability to participate in the Eruv, Mishechashecha Oser. But if halacha l'maaseh, this will call it Echad min hashuk died after Shabbos started, then ultimately again he would go ahead and prohibit upon the rest of the members of the chutzner. But why should it prohibit upon the rest of the members of the chutzner? Amai Oser Nivatel. Why not allow the yoresh? Why not allow the inheritor to go ahead and be mevatel his rishus? The Rebbe say what it sounds like over here is that halacha l'maaseh, that the inheritor does not have the ability to go ahead and be mevatel his rishus. So this seems to be a contradiction to Rav Nachman, to which the Gemara says, my oser nami diktani ad shivatel. What it means is that halacha l'maisa, the yoresh, prohibits upon the rest of the members of the chutzner until he goes ahead and is mevatel his rishus. So we brought this case ultimately again as a contradiction to the position of Rav Nachman, but it turns out that it may not be a contradiction to the position of Nachman. Fine. So we're still at the machlokes. Tashma, Yisrael v'ger sheruyin b'megura achos. But it's an interesting case. A Jew and a ger. Obviously, they're both Jews. You'll see the reason why it says the case of a ger in just a moment. But a Yisrael and a ger live together in a megura. That's actually very interesting. Rashi says a megura is goren, is a granary. So apparently what they used to have is they would have like these, I guess what you call it, like a converted granary. So you'd have a converted granary that would have a number of apartments inside of the granary. So what would happen? You have Yisrael and the ger who live together in apartments in this granary. In other words, they both have their own separate apartment. So what happens? If the ger died before Shabbos, I will say when we say ger in this context, ger refers to ger she'en lo yarshin. It's someone who it's a convert who has no relatives. Therefore, what happens when he dies? His property becomes hefker. His property becomes hefker. Says the Gemara. So Yisrael v'ger she'en megura achos umeisker mi ba'od yom. If the ger died before Shabbos started, so top of Ayin Aleph, afa pi shehichzik Yisrael achar b'nechasav oser. Even though, and I will say, we're going to read this, the wording is going to make very little sense, and the Gemara is going to call that out. But let's just read it now. We'll understand what the Havamina is, we'll see what the Maskana is. So literally translated, Afa pi shehichzik Yisrael achar b'nechasav, even though, so if the ger died before Shabbos, the halacha is, even though another Yisrael came along and acquired his property before the start of Shabbos, it still prohibits the other Jew from carrying inside of that granary, inside of the chutzner. However, if the ger dies after Shabbos starts, even though another Jew did not take possession of the ger's property, nevertheless, it doesn't prohibit. It says, what are you talking about? Hagufa kasha. Amrit mi ba'od yom. You just said before that if the ger dies before Shabbos starts, the ger dies before Shabbos starts, Afa pi shehichzik. So he's saying even though another Jew went ahead and acquired the property, ultimately again it's still asers. Velomi boy, and you take it for granted, kilo hichzik, that if somebody didn't acquire the property, then it would certainly be aser. But I don't understand. Adrabba, we'll say if the ger dies and no one else takes ownership over the property, what's the status of this living arrangement? It's just one Jew who's living there. If it's just one Jew who's living there, then the whole need for Eruv is obviated. Adrabba, kilo hichzik lo aser. If the ger dies and no one takes ownership over the property, Rabosai, there's nothing to talk about because there's only one Jew who lives in this area. And the halachas of Eruv are only triggered ultimately, again, if there's more than one Jew living there. To which the Gemara says, Amar Papa, Ima, afa pi shelo hichzik. Rather read it to say, even though no one else took possession of the property. But that's not what it says. It says, even though someone took possession, this is what it means to say. Even though someone did not go ahead and take ownership over it before it was Shabbos, rather only once Shabbos started, since he could have taken possession of the property before Shabbos started, therefore again, he asers upon the other Jew. However, if the ger dies once Shabbos starts, even if another Yisrael went ahead and took possession of the property, it doesn't aser upon the Jew who is already living there. So the Gemara says, are you telling me that that's true even though another Jew didn't take possession? But it goes without saying that if another Jew would have taken possession, Adrabah. But again, just the opposite is true. Ki hichzik aser. It should dafka be only when someone else takes possession that should aser upon the Jew who is already living there. To which the Gemara says, Papa, ema afa pi shehichzik. So you should read it rather as even though someone else took possession. I va'afa pi shelo hichzik hatani. But that's not what it says. it says even though someone else didn't take possession, this is what it means to say, even though someone else took possession, ultimately again, from when it became dark, since he was unable to take possession of it while it was still day, ultimately again he will not aser. Now both say, what's the takeaway from all of this? Katani miha reisha oser. I will say, but again, at the end of the day, what you see from here, from this case, is that it appears that when someone acquires ownership rights or on Shabbos itself, they aser upon the other residents from carrying, which would seem to indicate, the Gemara says, but Rav Nachman, if you're right, remember again, Rav Nachman is of the position that when Yitzchak, right, Abraham dies, Yitzchak, his son, inherits him on Shabbos. Rav Nachman is of the position that although, of course, Yitzchak, the new owner of the property, can't join in the Eruv. Why can't he join in the Eruv? Why not? Because it's Shabbos. It's already Shabbos. He can't join Eruv on Shabbos, but he can be Mabatal his Rishos. So the Gemara is asking Rav Nachman, I don't understand. If you are correct, then ultimately, again, why does new ownership on Shabbos ruin it for everyone else? Why not ultimately, again, just have the owner yield his ownership rights? And that way, again, it doesn't really help him so much, but at least it helps everyone else. To which the Gemara says, Katani miha reisha oser. Amai oser, why should he aser levatel? Let him yield his rights. To which the Gemara says, you're right. My oser diktani ad shiv vatel. We'll see you're right. The Gemara says, Rav Nachman will say you're right. What does it mean ultimately again? That he asers, it means that he asers until he yields his rights. That his presence will preclude anyone else from carrying in that chutzner. But he does have the ability to remedy the situation. How? By yielding his rights in the chutzner. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan says no. Masnisin money. So also Rabbi Yochanan says in general, these two brises that we are referring to, whose opinion do they reflect? Beis Shammai. They refer to Beis Shammai. The Amr Abbas, listen to this. This is actually really incredible, and this gets to the core of the issue. The Gemara says, Da Amrinan ein mevatel rishos b'Shabbos. Both say Beis Shammai is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, you cannot be mevatel a rishos on Shabbos. So both say Beis Shammai holds you can't yield your rights in a property on Shabbos. Now both say here we get to the real kishkas of the sugya. So listen to this. This now, because we learned me'ei masai nos in rishos. We'll say, from what point in time can you go ahead if you want to yield ownership rights in your property? At what point are you permitted to go ahead and do so? So the Gemara said, Beis Shammai say, Miba'od Yom. Beis Shammai say that if you want to yield property rights, you could only do so before Shabbos. No such thing as being mevatel rishus on Shabbos, only before Shabbos. So Beis Hillel says, Misha Techshak. Beis Hillel says you could even yield property rights on Shabbos. So you understand, by the way, how profound this machlokes is. This is perhaps one of the most far-reaching, far-reaching machlokes in Eruvin. This is not so much in Eruvin, but this is rather if you didn't participate in the Eruv. But you hear this? Can you go ahead and yield your rights to your property on Shabbos? And remember again, the nafkamina here is so dramatic, because this could range from a whole variety of circumstances. This could be from a person who just forgot to participate in the Eruv. This could be for a person who inherited property on Shabbos. Can I yield my rights on Shabbos? So Beis Shammai says no. Beis Shammai says you may not yield your rights on Shabbos. Beis Hillel says yes. So what's the pshat? We'll say Amar Ula, my time at the Beis Hillel. So we'll say, what's Beis Hillel's logic? Why does Beis Hillel allow you to yield property rights on Shabbos? See, here we go. This is fascinating. Nase ke'omer kelecha eitzal yafos. Because according to Beis Hillel, this is a case of like kelecha eitzal yafos. What does that mean? We'll say, take a look at Rashi. We'll say we're in Ayin Aleph, Amud Aleph, pretty much the middle of the page. What does it mean, kelecha eitzal yafos? Look at Rashi. Kelecha eitzal yafos, kabe tori meshach. This is fascinating. You know, the halacha is, there's an interesting discussion in the Mishnayos, in Truma, and also in Bab Metzia, about being Toreim She'eno Shalo. What happens if you take Truma from someone's property, but you didn't ask them? You didn't ask them. So I come over to Reuven's property, to Reuven's produce, and I take his Truma, but I never asked him. I never asked him if I had permission to do this. So what's talach? Look what Rashi says. Rashi says, Gabi Torim es shel chavero. I'm taking truma from my friend's property, shalomidas, but without his knowledge. Without his knowledge. So what happens? Tanya, ba balabayus who wants to shoot Torem, from kilecha etzel yafos. So let's listen to this. So let's say now, I'm going ahead taking truma from Ruvain's property, from Ruvain's produce, but he never asked me. So if Ruvain comes home and he says like this, kilecha etzel yafos, which I will say literally means, why didn't you tithe from the nicer produce? If he makes that statement to me, I will say, so watch this, says the Gemara, Em yesh lo yafos mehen, if Ruvain really had nicer produce, truma so truma, then my designation of truma on behalf of Ruvain works. The gali daite the nechale, because they both say apparently again Ruvain is expressing his appreciation or not content, but he's expressing his acquiescence. Thank you. He's expressing his acquiescence ultimately again to what it is that I did. And it turns out that in fact I acted as Ruvain's shaliach. Hachanami, kevan de batal hashta, galedaiti de meikari b'shar yusa nechale, ela sheshachach v'lo irev v'lo havele eknushuz. So listen to this. Interestingly enough, the case by Truma Rabosai is, so if I go ahead, I take Truma from Ruvain's produce without his permission. He comes back, he says, oh, you should have taken from nicer produce. So I say, interesting enough, just to finish that off, the Gemara says, if Ruvain has nicer produce, that shows that he acquiesced, okay? That he's happy with what I did. He's even telling me I should have even done nicer stuff. If it turns out that he doesn't have nicer produce, so we'll say, how do we interpret that statement? More as a sarcastic one. Like, who do you think you are? Why don't you just take everything? Why don't you take, and therefore, again, my designation would be invalidated as a result. So watch this. So Beis Hillel holds the following. Beis Hillel holds that essentially, when you're mevatel your reshus rabosai, that essentially is megaladas. That shows that your intention was, if possible, you would have even gone ahead and participated in Eruv beforehand. But for whatever the reason, you weren't able to go ahead and participate in Eruv. So because you weren't able to participate in Eruv, you do the next best thing of Bittul Rishus. To which the Gemara says, but here's the problem. Amra Abaye meis nachri b'Shabbos, mai kelecha etzel yafo. So Abaye says that svara works fine in a case where you had the ability to participate in the Eruv, but for whatever reason you didn't do so. What about the case of where I'm living in a courtyard, I'm living in a chutzner with a nachri? So I'll say, so remember again, how do you deal with your Eruv if you're living in a courtyard with a Nachri? There's only one way, and that's how? To lease his rights. But let's say the Nachri doesn't lease his rights, but then the Nachri dies on Shabbos. Oh, if the Nachri dies on Shabbos, I'll say, then possibly what we could do is one of us or all of us could be mevatel our reshus to one person, or there's a whole variety of different scenarios. But I will say, but in that case over here, how can you say that's comparable to Kelecha Eitzel Yafos? Because at the end of the day, the Nachri was alive on Erev Shabbos. There was no possibility for participation in an Eruv. To which the Gemara says, therefore, we'll say the Gemara rejects that and says, here is the svara for the Machlokas. And this is very profound because this really gets to the essence of Bittul Rishus. Tebe Shammai Savri, Bittul Rishus, Mikna Rishusahu. Mikna Rishusa b'Shabbos Aser. Wow. So I will say the fundamental machlokes is about the mechanics of Bittul Rishus. We'll say, what does it mean? See, if you just translate the word literally, what does Bittul Rishus mean? What does it mean? Nullification of your domain. So what does that mean? So I will say, what Beis Shammai means, it says it means is, you are conveying your ownership rights to someone else. So we all live in the Chatzar. I didn't participate in the Eruv. I messed all of you over. So what do? The only way to rectify it is to give up my rights. So Shammai says, what do you mean you give up your rights? Bittul Rishus. I'm yielding my rights to you. I'm conveying my ownership interest to you. Shammai says, you can't do that on Shabbos. You can't convey ownership interests ultimately on Shabbos. I will say, now what does that mean? If you look at Rashi, what's wrong with conveying ownership interest on Shabbos? To dami lamekachu memkar, because I will say that has the appearance of a business dealing. And I will say now, in general, anything resembling a business transaction is going to be asur on Shabbos. Why? It falls under the rabbinic prohibitions of that safeguard the malacha of kosev. Remember, ksiva kosev is one of the lamates malachas. engaging in anything that has the appearance of a business transaction is going to be asur, lest it lead to ksiva, lest it lead to writing. So therefore, Beis Shammai, this is fascinating, Beis Shammai says, you can't yield, you can't be mavatal Yerushos on Shabbos, because being mavatal Yerushos means I convey my interest over to you. Conveyance of ownership interest from one party to another, that's mekach umemkar. That's a business transaction. Mekach umemkar is going to be asur. Beis Hillel says something else. Beis Hillel savri, istaluke rishusa ba'amul. Beis Hillel says, no, in fact, what it is like this. I'm not really conveying my ownership interest to you. Rather, what am I doing? I'm removing my ownership interest from the chatzir. Very interesting, no? So I'm not being makneh to you. I'm not being makneh to you, but rather ultimately, again, all I'm doing is going in and pretty much removing myself. I'm removing, it's as if I don't exist. It's as if I don't live here. I'm removing my ownership interest from this chatzar. This the luki rishusa b'Shabbos shaper dami. And I will say the removal of ownership interest on Shabbos is totally permitted. So I will say it would appear that the mechanics more fall in line with Beis Hillel, because that's what we learned in Shabbos' daf, and also yesterday we saw it. How do you accomplish bittul rishus? Do you need a kinyan? Right? No kinyan is necessary. All you need to say is like rishusi mivutelas lachem. Right? In other words, you don't really. It sounds like really what you're doing is an ultimate, again, almost like negation. So really, about say the shaila is it a conveyance or is it a negation? Is it that I'm giving my ownership rights to you? That's Beis Shammai. Or is it more I'm just negating my ownership rights? Batul umavutul. It's just like it doesn't. Lahavi hefker ka'afra da'ara. It just doesn't exist anymore. And therefore, again, now the result ultimately is the same. But the nafkamina Rabbosai is, can you do it on Shabbos or not? Beis Shammai says no. Beis Hillel says yes. Rabbosai, that ends the sugya. So now what's the resolution about the Yoresh? So Rabbosai, so can a Yoresh go ahead and convey ownership interest ultimately again on Shabbos or not? That was the shaila. So the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, this is in Shin Pei Aleph Sif Vav, Shulchan Aruch Paskins, Yoresh Mevatel Rishus. For Yoresh, so let's say again in our case, Avraham died on Shabbos, his son Yitzchak inherits him. Obviously, Yitzchak can't join in the Eruv because it's already Shabbos, but Yitzchak can be mevatel his rishus on Shabbos. Shimlo irev morisha meis b'Shabbos, vayorish balador b'chatzer va'oser, yochol levatel rishuso. So we'll say the halacha Shulchan Aruch Paskins is that a Yorish inheritor can be mevatel the rishus that he inherited on Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah says, why is that? The Yorish kare da'avuahu. So we'll say, remember again, because the Gemara mentioned this yesterday, because an inheritor is considered to be like an appendage of his father. He's like the leg of his father. So when Yitzchak inherits Abraham's rights in the Chatzar, ultimately, again, on Shabbos, we don't view that as Panim Chadoshos Bo'olakan. It's not someone new, but rather, again, it's an extension of Avraham. And just as Avram had the ability to engage in Bittul Rishus on Erev Shabbos, so too, again, Yitzchak had technically that same right, and even though he did not exercise it, he can go and be mevatel his rishus on Shabbos. We'll say that is the halacha. Yoresh has the ability to be mevatel on Shabbos. Good Mishnah. Balabayis. We'll say another fascinating case. Balabayis shayesh shotef l'shchinas. We'll say so now we're switching gears just a little bit, going from eruv chatzeros to shituf muvos. It's the same idea. Same idea. So remember again, we know our setups. We have homes that open up into a shared chatzer. Chatzeros opened up into a shared mavui, a shared alleyway. But again, it's a street. It's a shared street. That street then went into Rishus Harabim. So the same way that homes need to join in an Eruv in order to carry in a common chatzer, Chatzeros need to join in what's called a shituf, a partnership, in order to carry in a jointly owned mavui. So listen to this. So listen to this. So if you have a balabas who is a shutaf to his neighbors, right? And he has a partnership in wine. We'll see exactly the parameters of this. Now we'll say, so again, these are individuals who live in different mavuos, different mavois, or at least that's what we're going to interpret it as now. So we'll say, so what happens? So Balabayas has a partnership with his neighbors in the mavos with wine. So what's the halacha? We'll say, they don't have to make a separate eruv. In other words, or when we say eruv, it really means shituf. So we'll say, essentially, the partnership in wine allows them, that counts as the shituf mavos. However, shemen, but if you have a partnership with one guy with wine and one guy with oil, then they have to make a separate sheet of muvos. So what the Mishnah is introducing us to is the concept that if it happens to be that members of the different mavuis, members of the different chatzeros, members of the different chatzeros happen to have a partnership in wine, that partnership in wine could act as the sheet of muvos. But if it's a partnership, one in wine, one in oil, that won't work. We'll see why. Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon says, no, even a partnership in wine and oil, that is enough ultimately, again, to go ahead and work for the shituf. Says the Gemara, Rav. So Rav says, Ubekli echad. We'll say, when do we say that halacha lamaisa? If the members of the various chatzeros have a partnership in wine, that partnership could count as the shituf, that's only if all of the wine is in one utensil. Because Rava said, if they have a partnership, one with wine and one with oil, they have to make a separate eruv, separate shituf. Say if you say at the first case the Mishnah is talking about where all of the wine is in one utensil, and the second case of wine and oil is two utensils, obviously Shapir. But if you want to say at the first case the Mishnah is also talking about where the wine is in two separate utensils, then what does it matter if it's separate utensils of wine or separate utensils of wine and oil? Amarle Abaye said, Yain v'yain ra'i la'arev, Yain v'shemen ein ra'i la'arev. Abaye will say, well, there would be a difference, because even if it's separate utensils of wine, those separate utensils are capable of being combined, versus separate utensils of wine and oil are not capable of being combined. So we'll say, so again, so the halacha, so what the Gemara is just qualifying this, that when we say, what we're introducing now is this concept that technically speaking, partnership in wine could a business partnership in wine could essentially go ahead and act as the shituf muvos, right? So again, if you can imagine again, Reuven, Shimon, Levi live in three different chatzeros that all border on the same mavui. Technically speaking, they all need to make a shituf muvos. All the Mishnah teach me is if they all happen to go ahead and have a partnership in wine, and that partnership wine is in one utensil, that counts as the shituf muvos. Even though, again, that partnership is a business relationship, that business relationship has the ability to go ahead and count for the shituf. Rabbi Shimon says, remember again, Rabbi Shimon says, but even if, we'll say if you could imagine, so if Reuben has a partnership with Shimon with wine, and he has a partnership with Levi with oil, so the Tanakama said that does not join all three. That can't count as a shituf. Rabbi Shimon says, yes, it does. So we'll say, so Rabbi Shimon says, yeah, it even works, even if Reuben has a partnership with Shimon with wine and with Levi with oil, it still combines all of them. Amar Rabba, how could that be? Amar Rabba, what's the case? Both we're actually talking about a situation over here where again there's a chatzar in between two mavois. So both it's not like we thought about before. They were making a shituf between three chatzeros. Rather, we're talking about a chatzar sandwiched in between two mavuos. So what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Both says shebein bein mavuos v'lo b'shituf b'mavoi echad ka'amar ela im zeh nishtatfa b'yayin v'im zeh b'shemen u'shnei eruvin. Oh. Both say when Reb Shimon says that even if the partnership is with one with oil, one with wine, that's not talking about the same thing as the first case, where it's three chatzeros and you want to merge them all into one shituf. This is talking about a chatzar sandwiched in between two mavuis, and the chatzar has to make one agreement with, or one shituf with the mavui on the left, and one shituf with the mavui on the right. So it's two different eruvin, one may or one two different shitufei, one ultimately again of yain, one of shemen. To which the Gemara says, Reb Shimon Latamei, Reb Shimon is going to his reason, because what Reb Shimon say, the son of Amar Reb Shimon, Lemad Davar Domer, to what could this be compared? L'shalosh chatzeros ha'psuchos, zulazu psuchos d'Rishus Ram. Supposed to be saw this case before. If you can imagine again, you have three chatzeros in a row. They each open to each other, and they also each open up into the Rosh Hashanah. If the two outer ones, remember again, we'll say A, B, and C. So if A and C go ahead and make an Eruv with B, Himutaras Iman, Vehemutaras Ima, Ushtaim Achitzonas Asuro Zum Zu. So we'll say if A and C both make an Eruv with B, so A is permitted with B, C is permitted with B, B is permitted with A, B is permitted with C, but A and C are prohibited to each other. So we'll say, so therefore again, Reb Shimon will say it's the same thing over here. When you have a chatzar in the middle, two mavuos, so the chatzar is going to make a shituf with one mavui with oil, one mavui with wine, and everybody's happy. And again, granted, Reb will say what that doesn't do is, it doesn't link the two mavuis, but it at least allows the middle chatzar to interact with both mavuis. To which one is by me dummy. How can you compare the cases? Hasam katani shtayim achitzonas asurim. Asuros, excuse me, I will say, there explicitly says in the case of three chatzeros that A and C are prohibited to each other. Halacha katani ein tzrichen la'arif klal. Both say the Mishnah makes it sound like that Reb Shimon is saying that halacha l'maisa all three areas are joined together. To which the Gemara says, or I should say, they don't need an eruv at all. My ein tzrichen la'arif. So we'll say, what does that mean? Ultimately, again, that it doesn't require my ein tzrichen la'arif shchinim bahadi balabayis. Aval shchinim bahadi hadadi tzrichen la'arif. So what does it mean? It means that ultimately, again, there is no additional eruv that's needed between, in this case, the shechina means the mavuis. The two mavuos do not have to go ahead and make an additional eruv with the balabayas, which is the chatzar. But if the two outer mavuis would want to join with each other, then einachinami, they would have to do something additional. So we'll say, so therefore, again, if the middle chatzar wants to make a shituf with the left mavui with wine and the right mavui with oil, that works just fine. But that only works to allow a relationship between the middle chatzar and the two outer mavuis. But if the two outer mavuis want to go ahead and interact with each other, they will require some other type of eruv arrangement. Amud Beis. V'Rav Yosef Amar, Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan beplugta Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'Rabbanan kamifik. So Rabbi Yosef has a different version. In his version, Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan, their machlokis, Rabbi says the same machlokis as Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Rabbanan. This time I will say, here we go. So we'll say their machlokas really is about the relationship of wine and oil with each other. Here we go. The Gemara says, this nan, shemen shetzaf al gabi yayin, v'noga tvul yom b'shemen. Well, this is an interesting case. Let's say you have wine and oil mixed together. Now, obviously, wine and oil don't actually mix together, but rather, again, what happens? The oil will float to the top. So now you have in one kli, you have wine and oil, but obviously the oil is on top, the wine is on the bottom. What's the halacha? V'naga tvul yom b'shemen. And we'll say tvul yom. Remember, who's a tvul yom? A tvul yom is a person who was tameh, went to the mikvah. The only thing he's missing is what? Head of shemesh. He needs sunset. So therefore he could convey tumah to certain items. So in this case, so the tvul yom touches the shemen. He touches the oil. Right? So we'll say, what's the shaila? What's the status of his maga, of his contact on the wine? So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Naga tvul yom shemen lo pasal ela shemen bilvad. He only went ahead and pasaled the wine. Since the wine sits separately and distinctly on top, since the oil sits separately and distinctly on top of the wine, he only asers the wine. He only asers the oil and not the wine. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, shneyan chiburin zelazeh. Both Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, even though the oil sits on top of the wine, they are connected. Literally, they rest one on top of the other, so they're considered to be one entity. And therefore, when the tvul yom touches the oil, that's effectively as if what? He is touching the wine as well. So the Gemara suggests, Rabbanan, Kirabanan. The Rabbanan, I will say, hold like the Rabbanan, namely what? That wine and oil are two separate entities. And therefore, we'll say, in this case of the Mishnah, when ultimately, again, of the three chatzeros, so chatzer B made an eruv with one with wine and one with oil, those don't combine, because wine and oil are two entities. But we'll say the only time that a partnership in an item can join everyone together is when it's the same item. But if with one chatzar it's wine, one chatzar it's oil, that does not combine all three into one entity. For Rabbi Shimon, who says that halacha l'maisa, no. Even if one eruv is made, or one shituf is made with wine, one shituf is made with oil, that combines everyone. Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And just like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that if the Tvul Yom touches the Kli, and the Kli on top of it has wine, it has oil, and on the bottom it has wine, it's considered to be like one entity, and if you touch the top oil, you convey Tumah to everything. So too, again, if you make a shituf with one chatzar with oil, one chatzar with wine, that's considered to be like one big shituf. So Tanya, Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai Omer, Echad zeh v'echad zeh tzrichin la'aretz. So we'll see, now we have another brayso. So the brayso says over here, the Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai says, in both of these cases, you require an Eruv. You require an Eruv. Now, I will say, here's what's interesting to note over here. Well, there's going to be a sub-discussion that we're going to start, at least today, which is as follows. In the case of the Mishnah, we're talking about a shituf muvaos, right? So just to be clear on our terms, a shituf, what we could just call a shituf for short, shituf muvaos, is the way you combine ownership interests so as to allow a group to carry in a common mavoi. So pretty much it works kind of the same way as an Eruv, but again we'll see that there are differences in the mechanics, but conceptually it's the same idea. So what an Eruv Chatzeros is to the Chatzer, a shituf muvaos is to a mavoi. The interesting shot that's going to come up will say is as follows. Imagine the following scenario. Imagine you have 4 chatzeros, right? 4 chatzeros that share a common mavui. So therefore they all entered into a shituf. Now the shaila is, does that shituf obviate the need for an individual Eruv chatzeros for each of those chatzers, for each of those courtyards? In other words, do we say, once there's a shituf between all of the chatzeros, they don't need a separate Eruv chatzeros for every single chatzer? Or do we say no? Two separate things. Shituf muvaos is one thing, but Eruv Chatzeros is going to be something fundamentally different. So watch this. So Tanya, Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai, Omer echad zeh v'echad zeh. In all of the cases of the Mishnah, so tzrichin la'arif. You need ultimately, again, you still need an Eruv. To which the Gemara says, okay, well let's analyze this. Va'afilu lezeh v'lezeh. And Rabbi says, is that true even if the shituf was done with everyone with wine? Amarava, ze ba belegino b'shafach, v'ze ba belegino b'shafach, kuli amalo plegi dahave eruv. So let's listen to this. So Rabbi says as follows. Rabbi says, when everyone comes with their own pitcher and they all pour their wine into one joint barrel, everyone agrees that, of course, such an arrangement works. We'll say now the chiddush over there is, even though this is not an Eruv arrangement, this is what kind of arrangement? This is a business arrangement. Nevertheless, everyone agrees that it works. The Gemara says, "Lo pligi ki pligi." Where does the machlokes come up? Kigon shalakhu chavishayim b'shutfus. But say, what happens if the members of the various chatzeros bought a barrel of wine b'shutfus? So they bought a barrel of wine in partnership. Rebbe Elazar ben Tadai savar ein bereira. So Elazar ben Tadai says, I will say, by the way, what I just told you about Eruv was a little bit jumping the gun. We're going to get to that in just a moment. Elazar ben Tadai says as follows. He says that halacha l'maisa ein bereira. But remember again, we know Breira well from our journeys through Shas. There is no such thing as retroactive clarification. And therefore, again, Abba say, halacha l'maisa, it's impossible to tell which of the wine belongs to each of the parties. For Rabbanan Savri Yeshber, the Rabbanan on the other hand holds that no halacha l'maisa, there is Breira. So Abba says, now there's a third opinion. Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai doesn't like the use of this joint barrel of wine for use ultimately, again, as the shituf muvos. He'll hold like this. If everyone comes along and brings their own pitcher of wine and pours it into a joint barrel, sure, that'll work. But if you're talking about a case of where they went ahead and purchased a barrel for commerce purposes, a joint barrel, but it's never clear whose wine belongs to who, Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai says there's no breira, there's no retroactive clarification, it's not clear which wine belongs to who, and this will not work for shituf muvos. Rabbi Yosef says, no. Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai v'Rabbana b'somchin al shituf b'makom eruv. So we'll say Rabbi Yosef says kamifliki. Rabbi Yosef, now we come to what I just told you before. Rabbi Yosef says, no, you know what they're arguing about? Rabbi Yosef, they're not arguing on the ability to create a shituf muvos. What they're arguing about is, when there is a shituf, is there a need ultimately again is there a need for an eruv chatzeros or not? That's the fundamental shaila. That when there is a shituf muvos, do you still require an Eruv Chatzeros? Demar Savra Ein Somchin, one opinion says that halacha lamaisa, just because you have a sheet of muvaos, doesn't obviate the need for an individual Eruv Chatzeros. Umar Savra Somchin. And one opinion says, no, where there is a proper shituf, that is enough. You do not require a separate Eruv Chatzeros. Amr Rav Yosef, Mina Aminallah. So Rav Yosef says, from where do I know this from? This is the machlokes. I will say, by the way, this is another major machlokes. Fascinating, right? If you have a proper sheet of muvaos, does that obviate the need for an individual eruv chatzeros or not? So Amar Rav Yosef, how do I know this? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, halach Rav Meir, because Rav said, or Rav Yehuda is saying of Rav, the halacha follows Rabbi Meir. Now, we'll see what Rav Meir is in just a moment. V'amar Baron Amar Rav, halacha Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi. And Rabbi Baron is in the name of Rav, that the halacha follows Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi. Shabbos says, the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Shabbos says, what's the link between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi? Shabbos says, remember, Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi is what we just said before. That halacha l'maisa, even in the case, ultimately again, of a proper sheet of muvaos, you are still going to require a separate Eruv Chatzeros. So the Gemara says, my time, Amalei Abaye, v'id chad taima, tarti ilchasa lamali. So Abaye says, if it's really the same svara, again, we're going to clarify this in just a moment. If it's the same svara, then why don't I need the halacha articulated twice? Hakamash malon, delo avdinan ketrei chumri be'eruvin. Comes to teach us that Rabbi said we do not act in accordance with two stringencies in Eruvin. So I just want to point out over here, what's happening over here is as follows. The Gemara is suggesting that halacha l'maisa, the point of contention over here, is whether or not you require a separate Eruv Chatzeros when you have a proper shituf muvaos. Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi says, yes, you do. The Rabbanon will say, no, you do not. We now have a statement of Rav Barona saying in the name of Rav that the halacha follows Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi, and the halacha also follows Rabbi Meir. Now, which Rabbi Meir? We don't know yet. So Gemara says, again, why is that? It must be because they are saying the same. I will say, we don't know what Rabbi Meir is saying yet. But the Gemara is suggesting whatever he's saying, he's saying the things of Rabbi Elazar ben Tadoi. And the Chiddush the Gemara is teaching us is that when it comes to Chos Eruvin, you do not paskin like two chumros. My Rabbi Meir, my Rabban. We'll say, what's Rabbi Meir? Let's at least begin this. I'm sorry, going quickly. My Rabbi Meir, my Rabban. The Sanya. Ma'arvin bechatzeros bepas. When it comes to Eruv Chatzeros, you can make an Eruv Chatzeros with bread. Vimratzu la'ari bayayin. So you know what? Actually, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with the my Rabbi Meir tomorrow. So we'll say, but just understand, I'm leaving you again with this cliffhanger. The cliffhanger is halacha l'maisa. In a situation where there is a proper shituf muvos, does that obviate the need for a separate Eruv Chatzeros or not? That appears to be a fundamental machlokas. What we also have to clarify, I will say, is under what circumstances can a pre-existing partnership arrangement, let's say partnership in wine or partnership in oil, act as a shituf muvaos or not? Both of those points in Meir to be clarified and resolved tomorrow. Shkoyach.